feast, right? That's the parable we're going to be going into this morning. And just like we've done with all of the other parables, we're going to take a look at the context, who the characters are in the parable, what they represent, and all that good stuff. And we're going to do it in the same way. So we're going to identify the characters in group one, the people in group one, the people in group two, the people in group three, so we can actually see what Jesus is saying. So, with that being said, Matthew 22, and we're going to look starting in verse 1. It's the parable of the wedding feast. Before we get into that, what are some things we need to remember about parables? We've kind of been over this before. What is important to note about parables in general?
The group of people that Jesus is talking to, who are they?
Well, that's
Probably the ones Jesus is talking about.
I'm just saying parables in general,
Oh.
not parables Jesus told.
It's a story to make a point of the
Yeah.
teaching.
It's a teaching story, okay? Okay. Are the people in parables usually real people? No. Usually made up for the story. There are instances, like with Lazarus and the rich man, where in the we can find in the Talmud and the Mishrad, or the Midrash rather, the same parable told with a name. Generally, though, stories don't the parables don't have names because you're supposed to fill in who the characters are based on what the rabbi is trying to say. Okay. They're teaching stories. They always have some sort of lesson, right? Because they are teaching stories. The lessons are important. That's why you tell them. They are a rabbinic style of teaching. So when a rabbi or when a disciple would ask a rabbi a question, the rabbi would usually respond with a parable. Why do you think rabbis would respond with parables? There's something about stories that stick with us. Okay? Yeah. So there's something about stories that speak to us on a level, both mentally and spiritually, that we hang on to. I mentioned the other day, there's only 7 types of stories that we generally tell, right? And any one of the stories that we tell fall into one of those 7 categories because stories tend to really speak to us. And so they're easy to remember. And parabolic styles of stories, or even fables, which use animals, always seem to just pop into mind, like the tortoise and the hare, right? That is a story, that's a fable, that's a teaching story, and we all remember the lesson. All I have to do is say the tortoise and the hare, and you've kind of got that logged away back in your brain. You know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm referencing. If I say the scorpion and the toad, right? Generally, that's a story that you're going to remember. There's a parable behind there. They're short, they're easy to remember. I see some confused faces about the scorpion and the toad. Do you guys not know that one? Scorpion and the toad. Yeah. The toad can swim across the river, okay? And he's swimming back and forth. The scorpion wants to get from one side of the river to the other. And he can't do it by himself. So he talks to the toad and he says, Toad, I would like for you to carry me across the river. Do you think you can do that? And the toad goes, no, you're going to kill me. I know you. You're a scorpion. You're going to kill me. And the scorpion goes, no, I won't. Because if I kill you as we're going across the river, I'm going to kill me too. I wouldn't do that. The toad thinks about it for a second. He says, okay. So he lets the scorpion crawl up on his back and he starts climbing, going across the river. About halfway across, he feels a pinch in his back because the scorpion just stung him. And he says, "What have you done? You've killed us both." And the scorpion says, "I'm sorry, it's just in my nature." Okay? Really simple, really easy to understand. The moral of the lesson is you can't always trust everybody, right? Trust the thing for what it is, right? If you know somebody's going to stab you in the back because that's their nature, don't trust them. Okay, that's the moral of the story. Parables also have morals of the story. They're a little bit more involved. Okay? As you can see, especially in this parable, we have 3 different groups. There have been times where we've only had 2 groups. Generally, though, with most of the parables Jesus tells, there are 3 groups of people. And each of these groups of people represent something different. The other thing that we need to remember about parables is parables are always archetypal. That's a fancy word, but generally it means they follow a pattern. So I just saw something. They're putting things away, putting Christmas decorations away, and I just saw a tub fall through the window frame. But parables are always archetypal. So generally speaking, when Jesus is telling a parable, there are instances, like with this one, where he's telling a new parable, but he's always either connecting it back to the Old Testament or to some sort of tradition or to stories like when we did the prodigal son. We saw that there was a story like the prodigal son in the Midrash, right? And the Mishnah. There are stories like that. So sometimes Jesus will borrow those forms to tell a story. And so with this, we talked about the vineyard last week, right? And the vineyard and how that is drawn from the Old Testament in Isaiah, where Isaiah compares Israel to a vineyard. And that's very common imagery. So Jesus lists that archetype to tell a story, to tell a parable, right? But they always have those archetypes. All right. So let's start our reading. Matthew 22, starting in verse 1. And Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, who is the them? You got to dig back through the scripture here to figure out who the them is. So really, we have to go all the way back to 21:23 in order to understand who the audience is. It should be 20:23. 21:23. We have to go all the way back there. And when he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching. So who's he teaching? He's teaching the people. And then, not Gentiles, he's teaching sinners and tax collectors. Yeah. So generally when Jesus is teaching in the temple, he's teaching the people who are coming to the temple to offer sacrifices. It's only later, generally, that the chief priests and the Pharisees and the scribes and that kind of thing, they show up because they've seen Jesus has drawn a crowd. All right? So he entered into the temple, and the chief priests and the elders of the people, Pharisees and Sadducees, came up to him as he was teaching and said, by what authority are you doing these things? So that kind of couches who are who we're talking to here. It's the same crowd that he just told the parable of the wicked tenants to. Right? The tenants rent the vineyard. They're in charge. The king sends the father sends his son, or sends servants to tell them it's time to harvest and all of that, and they kill the son eventually. We're going to see similar themes in this. So verse 22, and Jesus spoke to them in a parable, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. So who can we see in we'll call it group 3? Who are some of the characters in group 3?
The king
The king. Okay.
would probably be God.
Well, we're not there yet.
Oh,
So there's a king. Who else is there? There's a son. Okay. Who would be the prince, right? All right. So those are 2 people we can identify. And sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, but they would not come. Who are some other people that we can now start filling in? So we've got servants, okay? Okay. Would the invited guests belong in group 3 or would they belong in a different group? So do we want to put them in group 1 or group 2?
2.
We'll put them in group 2. Okay. Invited guests. All right. But they would not come. Verse 4. And again he sent other servants, saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they, the invited guests, paid no attention. And one went off to his farm, another to his business, and the rest seized the servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. Okay. So, are you seeing some similarities to the tenants in the vineyard? Okay, that's what we talked about, not last week, but 2 weeks ago. All right, because we didn't have it last week. All right. The king was angry and sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. We probably put troops over here, but troops aren't really necessarily a character, but they do belong in group 3. And destroy those murderers and burn their city. Then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those who are invited are not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you can find. Okay. And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all those whom they found, both the bad and the good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. Who can we find is this in this next group? Street people, okay? So,
General populace.
It's hard to read writing.
so the street people. Gather them from the roads. Yeah, anyway.
We have a light for reporters.
You can turn it on. It's going to be a glare.
Actually, the blue found people there.
No, that helps. Thank you. It does help.
This one would go off.
How's that?
Turn this one off.
All right. Yeah, we don't need all the lights.
Okay. So we've got the street people over here.
Oh, that makes a big difference now.
Yeah, now you can see very well.
We could also say / uninvited guests, but we're not going to say that because we'll get there. But they got invited. But those are the people who weren't initially invited, okay?
But you did say something about the good people and the bad people.
Right.
there's
So
a combination of good and bad.
good, bad. Okay. So there you go. All right. So the wedding feast was filled with guests, but when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there was a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? And he, the man, was speechless. The king then said to his attendants, bind him hand and foot and cast him into outer darkness. In the place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. Okay. So who can we put, who's the next person that we can invite here, that we can put up here? There seems to be a fourth group, right?
Yeah.
So we can say group 4. And generally, this guy is referred to as the naked man, okay?
As the what?
As the naked man,
Okay.
because they strip off all his clothes and they throw him outside the gate, okay? All right, so now we have to ask ourselves some questions. Who are these characters and how can we identify them? Who is the king? We already said he was God. Okay, so the king is God, which makes sense, right? Who's the son? Jesus. Who are the servants? Prophets. Yeah. But yeah, we'll keep that there for the timing. All right. And who could the troops be? Because they're not really important to the story, but some can argue they're angels.
Angels.
Okay, I mean,
Could they be enemies like the Syrians or whatever you use?
they could be, but they're the king's army. So the king sends his own troops to do the destruction. Okay. So I've heard that argument before. I don't think the troops are important to the story, but that is a thought that's out there. Who are the invited guests? Israel. We could say, yeah, the religious elite, because they're the ones that have the training and stuff. Okay.
Maybe all Jewish people?
Not necessarily, because who's the part that's in the street people? No, they're not Gentiles.
But they were all given religious training till 12.
Right, but there's a difference between the religious elite, who know better, who have the invitation, and the other group of people that's here, who are identified as tax collectors, sinners. Yeah.
So you're saying that the street people never got the chance to learn until age 12?
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is we have two groups of people here, or two groups of people that Jesus is talking to.
Right.
He's talking to the tax collectors and sinners who are coming to offer the sacrifices and stuff, right? They're the ones who are constantly flocking to Jesus, who are talking to him all kinds, and whose presence generally attracts the religious elite, the scribes, the Pharisees, the chief priests, all of that. So when Jesus is teaching here, he's talking to two specific groups of people in this story for the purposes of this story. So we have to identify who the people are represented in the parable. So there are two groups of people, the religious elite and the tax collectors and sinners. Just because they received religious training until they were 12 doesn't mean they're part of this group. This is the group that is living out the law, they're living out the oral traditions. They're the ones who are, like we talked about earlier today, who are the Pharisees, who are keeping the religious codes and all of that. They're the religious elite. They're the ones who, like Jesus said to Nicodemus earlier today, you should know these things, you should know better. You call yourself a teacher of Israel, but you don't do that. Who are the people that killed the prophets? Well, it wasn't the street people, it wasn't the tax collectors and sinners. It was the religious elite, it was those who were in power, right? Who ends up killing Jesus? Well, it's not the street people, the tax collectors and sinners, it's the religious elite. So when we talked about in the parable just previous to this, the father says, surely I will send my son and they will respect him. But what do the tenants do to the son? They kill him. Okay? So in that parable, we have the people that are brought into the vineyard to take possession of it, who are the tax collectors and sinners, right? And then we have the religious elite, who are those who killed Jesus, just like they killed the prophets. Okay? It's the same group of people. It's the same kind of story. He's just telling it in a different setting. So the invited guests, we have the tax collectors and sinners, who are the ones that are in the highways and the byways, right? The street people. They're the ones who didn't receive the invitation or the hyper-religious training that we've got over here with the chief priests, the Levites. These are the professional clergy, might be a better way to put that, who have a greater responsibility because of the knowledge that they have. So they kill the prophets. They kill. They're going to kill Jesus eventually. Um, these religious elites are going to be the ones who persecute the apostles, right?
But didn't you read that they got killed?
The prophets did.
The troops killed the invited guests.
Well, they destroy the invited guests' country, but some of them, remember, some of them leave, some of them go back to their own farms, some of them go away. We're not sure where to. But yeah, so the religiously kind of scatter, basically, is how that goes. Yeah.
How does the Sadducees fit into that?
The Sadducees were the ones that were in control of the temple. So they were the ones who were responsible for the administration of the temple, for the setting up of the we would call it maybe the preaching rotation, but the service rotation of the different Levitical families and those kind of things. They were the ones who were responsible for doing that.
Would they fall into group 2?
Yes. Yep. Pharisees, Sadducees, the scribes. Remember, Jesus has more interaction with the Pharisees than he does with the Sadducees. So, because he's calling out his own from within. And that's really why we see him interacting with them more. Because the Sadducees are more secular. In fact, when it comes to the destruction of Jerusalem, you really don't see much from the Sadducees anymore after 70 AD. What you see then is the rise of rabbinic Judaism, or the Pharisees come into power, which then eventually morphs into rabbinic Judaism that we have today. So the rabbinic Jews, the Orthodox Jews, that's what we have as leftovers or holdovers from the Pharisaical tradition. Okay, so the invited guests are basically told to, they're scattered. Their country is taken away from them. Their city is destroyed. Very akin to what happens to Jerusalem in 70 AD. Okay, so troops could even. I mean, if we want to say, that's why I think this is dubious. The troops aren't important to the story. It's just a kind of a, it's just there to show the destruction of the city. But the invited guests are the ones who fall under judgment, right? Because they know better. The tax collectors and sinners, the street people, they come in, but as is common with Jewish weddings, you actually had to wear wedding clothes. So part of the invitation would have been, come to the king's palace for a feast, for the wedding for his son, who is always described as the bride. No. Church is not described as the bride of Jesus. Israel. Israel is described as the bride of Jesus. So Jesus is marrying Israel. Okay, so that's the kind of the picture of what's going on here. And then, of course, you have these denominations within Israel. So the religious elite get judged. And then the tax collectors and sinners get that invitation. They're to dress up. They're to come in, which is kind of symbolic of salvation. And so when they come into the feast, because they're in the right clothes, because they've responded to the invitation, they get to come in. Okay? As opposed to the invited guests, which rejected the invitation. They had the invitation in hand. They rejected the call. Okay?
You would have thought they would have been so excited.
Right.
You were waiting all this time for the Messiah to come. You would have thought they would have grabbed hold of him.
Uh-huh.
But it didn't meet their parameters.
Right.
It wasn't the guy they wanted.
Hence what Jesus says to Nicodemus, you're a teacher of Israel and you don't know these things? Yeah.
But why did the guy have the audacity got to come in the wedding clothes?
So that's the naked man. That's that guy over there. So he is one of the street people. right? He's invited in as the servants go back out and say, listen, come to the wedding feast that's been prepared. Part of this is putting on wedding garments, like your tuxedo and your dress and those kind of things. Think that, your fancy clothes. The naked man, he sneaks over the fence. He doesn't come in through the door, right? Whether he didn't have wedding clothes or didn't have money to go out and buy wedding clothes, he tries to sneak into the wedding. He's a wedding crasher. Okay? And so when the king sees him and that he's not in a wedding garment, he's thrown out into the outer darkness. He's thrown out of the kingdom. So that's a man who tries to not in the parable.
Eat all the good food.
Right. So he responds to the invitation, but not in the right way. He doesn't put on. He doesn't. No. He's there.
I want the goodies, but I don't want to. Okay.
But I don't want the responsibility of having the right clothes, i.e., making a profession of faith in Christ. I don't want to do that. So he tries to sneak in the back door and gets caught. And then he gets judged just like the invited guest did. Okay? Any questions?
Which in a way, you go to group one and you say, this is a good group here, but there's exceptions.
Yeah.
And that's what he's in some sense saying.
Yep. And then if you think of the
exception to
Yep.
this group that goes,
well, if you think about the parable of the sower, right, which was another one I might have done.
for
You've got the three different groups. You've got the group that responds wholeheartedly, it takes root and it grows. You've got the group that falls along the rocky road and they don't, nothing happens for them. It's the naked man. You've got it that falls along the thorns that gets choked out, right? So you've got these, that's within this group of people here. Okay, so not everybody from this group is
it's a good guy.
is a good guy, right? Is going to be saved. But these are the people that are responding, at least, to Jesus' call, to the invitation. Okay? These are the people that have the invitation but reject the call. So if you think of the invitation as like the scriptures, right? They have the scriptures, they have the invitation. John has called them, Jesus is calling them, and still they reject the call to go to the wedding feast. These people didn't get the invitation at first, right? So these are the people who have left the faith, so to speak, left the Jewish faith. They're not practicing it. They're the harlots and the traitors and all of these people, the people that are downcast in society, that are looked down on by the religious elite. And they're the ones who hear the well-meant offer, who hear the invitation, and respond positively, except for the naked man who responds positively but doesn't do so in the right manner. Okay?
I know this is a parable, but in real life back then, you had the elite, the Sadducees, Pharisees, but a lot of this people living everyday good life is trying to be good Israelites.
They still weren't the religious elite.
They weren't-
So those are even those people are the ones that are responding to Jesus.
Yeah, but they weren't trying to be, they're trying to follow religious laws, et cetera, et cetera. So
Could have been, but again, they're not the religious elite. Their religious education, I mean, isn't the level of responsibility that teachers have. Remember, teachers are judged harsher because they have more knowledge, they have more access, they have more responsibility. Yeah, they're the ones that are doing the teaching of the Torah and the oral tradition. Whereas your regular guy is not going to be doing that. Your regular guy might be doing the sacrifices and going to the temple or his local synagogue and learning and hearing it taught, but they're the average churchgoers. They're not the religious elite. Yeah, yeah. They're either the average churchgoer or they're the ones that are like far away from church. Yeah. But there was a stratus. There were strata of social in the social order where you have the religious elite way up here and everyone else is kind of way down here.
Can you imagine the excitement of those people, though, that are invited
Uh-huh.
to go into the palace
Yeah.
and all that would be involved?
Well, that's why we see thousands
Whoa.
and thousands and thousands of people. I mean, Jesus feeds 5,000 men, to say nothing of the women and children, right? Who are there. This is why he's drawing like crowds so big that he has to get on a boat to teach. That's not made up of these guys, generally, or majority of these guys. It's made up of a majority of these guys. So when Jesus is teaching in Galilee, he's pulling tax collectors, he's pulling sinners, he's pulling the regular synagogue attenders. And remember, the Pharisees are kind of the backwoods preacher, right? They're the one. So that's why he's challenged by the Pharisees so often in those instances, because they're the ones that are there. Any other questions? So always look at the audience when Jesus is talking, when Jesus is giving a parable, because the audience will help you fill in this diagram as to who God is talking, or who Jesus is talking about, and their roles within the story. So, what is the question that a lot of these parables are told in response to? So you have to scroll back a little bit, or turn your Bible back a little bit. The question the Pharisees ask him: by what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? So when he's talking, he puts himself in the place of the son, and he's either the son of the landowner or he's the son of the king. And he's like they don't see that, right? Because the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious elite, kind of in their defense, have been blinded so that the crucifixion will happen. So they're not seeing it. That's part of the reason they're rejecting it. As a majority. There are people, however, like Nicodemus, like Gamaliel, who are seeing what it is. And ironically, Gamaliel is also a Pharisee. Paul was a Pharisee. And so you've got Pharisees coming to the defense of the early church early on. When the Sadducees want to wipe them out, you've got people like Gamaliel saying, hey, if it's of God, you can't, there's nothing you can do to stop it, right? So that's kind of interesting. But then you've also got or Saul, who's a Pharisee, who's one of the biggest persecutors of the church, who's a Pharisee, so there's that. So not all of them were the majority. But the majority, especially the Sadducees, especially some of the more liberal-minded Pharisees, were the ones rejecting him.
In some sense, it's almost heartbreaking that these people that are so dedicated to the law, they spend such volume of time studying and learning and talking about and absorbing it.
Mm-hmm.
In some sense, it's so sad that they're left out.
Yes. Yep. Yep. All right. Well, that's the wedding feast.
Thank you.
So you're quite welcome. We'll see you all on the new year.
Okay.